Muted.
Okay, welcome everyone. Sorry for that, the noises in the background there. I think we've resolved that with one of our panelists. I just wanted to welcome everyone to our webinar, Restoring Public Trust in Law Enforcement. This is part 2 of our webinar series, and today we're going to focus on how training can enhance public perception. My name is Chris Anderson. I'm a part of the ASMI business development team here at Paladin Data Systems. Today's webinar will be a 1-hour panel discussion with our new guest panel of current and former law enforcement leaders. We're going to build on last month's webinar where we covered the current decline in public perception of law enforcement. Today we'll take a deeper dive and take a look at the current state of public perception, including a review of a recent article by one of our panelists, Rich Johnson. We'll also get a different perspective from our new panelists, and then spend the bulk of our time focusing on, again, on the training and how improved training can help to restore that public perception and that public trust. Some of the issues that we'll cover today include how de-escalation training in decision-making in stressful situations, force science findings, risk management, and other officer knowledge can produce better policing and overall improve public perception. But first, let me just cover a few of the logistical details about the webinar format. So the agenda today, again, just a welcome to our audience and our panelists. I'll do a panelist introduction here in just a moment. And then we'll get into the meat of the webinar. We'll allow our panelists to discuss some of the issues that I mentioned here and give their perspective from both their law enforcement experience as well as their current experience. And then we'll have a section at the end for question and answer. About the last 10 to 15 minutes, we'll open it up for a discussion. If you do have any questions, you can submit those via the chat function in the GoToWebinar. So with that, I'd like to bring in my co-moderator, Terry Thiele. Terry, you want to introduce yourself?
Great. Yeah, welcome everyone. Terry Thiele. I am business development for the ASMI platform here at Paladin Data. And my background for about the last 10 years have been dealing with the cops within the Department of Defense. So all 4 branches of the military as well as a couple of the agencies too. And my goal is to really help learn what the challenges are for training, and I'm really excited to take part in this presentation today.
Great, thanks Terry. So now I'd like to take a moment and allow our panelists to introduce themselves. We'll start with Dave Blake. Dave, why don't you give an overview of your background in law enforcement and a little bit about what you're working on today? Dave, did you hear me all right? Apparently we're having a little bit of issue with Dave being able to hear me. I'll give a little bit of background and we'll try to pull him in here. Dave Blake is currently runs Blake Consulting and Training. He has a background in law enforcement, specifically in training, and hopefully we can get him in here and he can give a bit of background on his background in law enforcement. Roy's also going to be joining us here in a moment. Jim Fuda. Jim, you want to give a background on your experience, your current role, and your experience in law enforcement? Rich, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Why don't you
okay,
go ahead and give your background as we try to bring the other panelists in here. Why don't you give your background?
Okay, this is Rich Johnson. I'm a professor of criminal justice at the University of Toledo in Ohio. I hold a PhD in criminal justice from the University of Cincinnati. My primary area of teaching and research is on police management and police-citizen interactions. And prior to becoming an academic, I was a trooper of the Indiana State Police, and then a detective with the Kane County State's Attorney's Office in Kane County, Illinois, Metro Chicago area.
Great, thanks, Rich. Dave, are you able to hear us now?
Yeah, I'm back in, I think.
Great,
thanks.
If you wouldn't mind giving an overview of your background and what you're currently working on.
Sure. I'm retired from law enforcement. Spent the majority of my career involved in tactics and use of force training and practical skill sets. As I progressed on, I became very, very interested in human factors science and the application of science to policing in performance and some of the areas specific to use of force. I've continued to stay involved in law enforcement through my consulting company, Blake Consulting, and I also do some contract teaching through law enforcement throughout the West Coast on applying human factors science to use of force. And lastly, I've also maintained my my input into law enforcement training as a force option simulator instructor at one of our California larger regional training centers.
Great, thanks, gentlemen. I'll just check again. Jim, Fuda, are you on? Are you able to hear us? Or Roy? All right, we'll continue to try to get those two panelists on here. In the meantime, we'll go ahead and get right into, again, the meat of our discussion. We're going to kick it off with a discussion on an article that Roy published back in July. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Terry, and he'll walk us through that.
Okay, Rich, actually, thank you. This was my introduction to you, was kind of this article that you put out in July that was on all of the different, I want to say the elements of law enforcement and all of the different studies on public perception. And just for those who are only listening, I wanted to read this quote, and I quote, "In democracies, law enforcement agencies must have the popular support of the people. Without this popular support, government and its police are viewed as a totalitarian system. When the average American begins to question the integrity and the legitimacy of the police, then our nation is in serious trouble. Therefore, law enforcement officers and agencies must conduct a self-examination to determine if they are doing everything they reasonably can to keep the average citizen safe and happy, so that these citizens will support them in dark times such as the present." So with that, Rich, would you like to maybe give us a little background as to kind of how you pulled that information together and why you focused on that particular study?
Yeah, I do, in addition to the research stuff on the academic side, I do some police training through a couple different police training organizations, and you know, with all the issues that have been going on in the country for the last 1.5 to 2 years, you know, dealing with the way the police are really being bashed in the media, and just the way the entire law enforcement profession is taking a black eye here. The next step is to move on to win back our citizens, win back our community. And so as a first step to that, I dug up every single study I could find published since the year 2000, and I'm looking at what's correlated with citizen satisfaction with the police. And I could have gone back a lot farther than that, but many people are skeptical of anything older. But I'll tell you, the older research backs up the same thing the newer research is saying. And it's basically the absolute strongest predictor of citizen satisfaction with the police overall, just general satisfaction with all police, is whether or not they had a recent negative contact with a law enforcement officer. And when you dig down into that with the research, negative contact isn't they just got a ticket. That's what tends to be more important is frequently called procedural justice. Was I treated fairly? Whether or not I got a ticket or whether or not I went to jail, but was I treated fairly in the process? Was I treated with dignity and respect, or was I cussed out, not given an opportunity to tell my side of the story, things like that? And so definitely, recent negative contact with the police was about 50% of what influences citizen attitudes towards the police, and then to a lesser extent was perceptions of crime and disorder in a person's neighborhood, not actual crime and disorder, but at least perceptions of how bad crime is and their fear of crime, followed by media exposure. The more media exposure they had, the more negative their views towards the police, and then perceptions of how many personal resources or how much resources are the police dedicating to me and my neighborhood and my community. So, for instance, do I feel the police care about crime in my particular neighborhood, and are they doing things that I can see to address those issues? So those are the big primary predictors of citizen satisfaction with the police. So my argument is if we can tackle these things, which actually deal more with perception than they do actual crime fighting, but if we can tackle these things, we can start to stem this tide and turn it around and try to win back popular support in the United States for law enforcement.
Well said. That's interesting. And from that, Dave, do any of those points stand out to you that you'd like to maybe comment on?
Oh, absolutely. Almost intuitively, you can derive some of those responses. Certainly there is a huge perception that has to do with whether or not an individual citizen feels like they had a negative or positive contact with a police officer. And there's the real question is as well is to how many factors go into that perception. Is it solely the attitude of the officer? Is it a portion of that individual's understanding of the law, or is it does it have to do with how much the officer explained to them why they did what they did during this event? And I think by finding answers to some of those points, that's where we're going to at least attempt to change perspective. And just one example of that is simply, and I've heard this many times, either secondary or firsthand on the street, where an individual gets pulled over, maybe their vehicle gets searched or they get pulled out of the car, and other than that they're treated respectfully, but their belief is I didn't do anything wrong, why is this officer taking these steps against me, so on and so forth. And ultimately what that may come down to is that the officer, they don't understand the legal aspects of what was done, and if that officer doesn't take the time to explain it as to what his legal basis was for taking these actions, then of course that person's going to drive away with a negative perception and believe that they were unjustly searched or seized or any number of things. And the only other point that I would really like to focus on is, I don't know what the percentages was, but he mentioned it as the third point, is that media exposure. We live in a society today that it seems like the unintended consequences of social media is very quick, very attention-grabbing titles or just attention-grabbing type of things that people only seem to pay attention to those first 30 seconds or maybe even 15 seconds of information that they're getting, and they don't do any deeper research or want to find out the end result of the situation, get a full explanation. And everybody's getting tidbits of information from their Twitter in 120 or 140 characters or less, or a Facebook article, and all these small social media points are just giving out this very powerful initial statements with not a lot of depth in the actual narrative. And that could lead to a lot of people getting a wrong impression or even creating implicit bias down the road with how they feel about law enforcement because of these negative titles and things like that.
Okay. Good points, Mo. Hey, Roy, are you on with us now?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Awesome, thank you. Hey, Roy, would you take just a quick moment to give us a quick little introduction for you, and then if you wanted to be able to comment on anything that we have up right now, that'd be great.
Okay, Roy Alston. I'm a lieutenant with the Dallas Police Department in Dallas, Texas. I've been with the police department for about 13 years now. I've written a couple of books. I served on the Department of Justice assessment team for the After Action Review for Ferguson, Missouri, and that document was released about a month ago. My specialization is in the area of police legitimacy, procedural justice, fair and impartial policing, things around that particular area. As a matter of fact, I'm in the process of developing coursework for my department and beyond in those particular areas. So let me make a comment about the public's perception of law enforcement. There's no doubt that that perception has radically changed over the last couple of generations. There was a time when people really looked up to the police and they felt as if they could trust the police. But I will tell you there are some things that have happened in the recent past and then historically that have eroded that trust over time. And what we're experiencing in public policing today is the aftermath of that erosion over time. Policing in America, public policing in America has done a very poor job of safeguarding the public trust and making sure that the narrative is such that it is fair and balanced. For example, when the assessment team was in Ferguson, Missouri, doing a deep dive on the analysis of what happened after the shooting of Mike Brown, what we quickly discovered was that people had not been had lost trust in the police generations prior to what happened in Ferguson, Missouri. And unfortunately, and to Dave Blake's point, the social media grabbed onto what was happening in these short snippets, and the police were not prepared for that. As a matter of fact, when we were on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri, there was not a single police agency that had a Twitter account. And we could pinpoint the exact moment when the incident in Ferguson, Missouri took a life of its own inside of after the Ferguson incident. But they simply didn't know things were going on around them because their focus was completely different. It wasn't about building the public trust in St. Louis County, and I can't say that more clearly. It was about the predatory police practices that resulted in the mistrust. But I'm here to tell you that's probably more, it's happening more and more than we think across the country. So people who are upset with the police are justifiably so, and we have to do the tough work of fixing public policing. Public policing has to fix public policing, and the public can't. It's going to be very difficult for the public to force change because typically the change is we're going to put civilian oversight, and in the history and the research shows that oversight of the public policing usually results in even much more worse results. I'm of the position that public policing has to fix public policing. We suffer from the effects of bad policing. Bad police officers out there doing bad things, and only public policing is going to fix that. So there you go.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Roy. I appreciate that. Hey, Jim, are you on with us now? I'd love for your take on this too. Okay. All right, great. Well, let's move ahead. Jim will join us when he can. Let's look at here. It's interesting. I'd love to kind of change gears a little bit and talk a little bit related to the PERF report that came out in August. And it's interesting, obviously we focus on the importance of training, and it was surprising to see the very first contention in this, the PERF report, and I read as follows: the training currently provided to new recruits and experienced officers in most departments is inadequate. So I'd love to get each of your kind of views on that and perhaps your approach towards training and where its importance might lie. And so, Rich, could we start with you, if that's all right? Okay.
Yeah, there's just a couple ideas or thoughts that come up right away. Is with training, and I'm sure the other panelists will be talking about the inconsistencies across agencies. But what the drum I'm beating right now is that We've done overall, I think, a pretty good job with dealing with use of force training as far as officer survival aspects of it. You know, trying to make that as realistic as possible. I mean, we don't even use paintball guns. We make sure we use simunitions that function exactly like our actual duty weapon, so that under stress we know exactly how we'll act, and how important that is to make your use of force situations and your officer safety training as close to the real thing as possible. But then we drop the ball when, how often are we actually using force, especially deadly force? And not that often. And how many times are law enforcement officers within the course of a day having to deal with verbal conflict? And I think when you dig into the majority of these use of force incidents that have been controversial, it started with a verbal conflict at the beginning for a lot of these. And if they had potentially had been handled differently with a verbal conflict, that may have avoided use of force, maybe not. But at the very least, it would have kept it off of YouTube. You know, when you Google or search through YouTube and look for incidents of bad police conduct on traffic stops, you know, there's thousands of video clips to see. You know, some of them are taken out of context, but regardless, where the officer blows his or her cool. And there's very, very few examples floating around out there on the internet where an officer was just a perfect communication professional. And I think the real reason for that is we're expecting officers to have this as just common sense, but we're not training them in how to engage verbally with people that are going to be hostile, with people who are going to try to be manipulative, and how to deal with those situations and how to deal with them under stress. Just going through as much stress training as we do with officer safety related things, as we should be doing the same with verbal interactions. You know, we ought to be, for as many times as an officer gets shot with simunitions or has to shoot a real target or engage with a FATS machine, they need to be dealing with a verbally aggressive or manipulative citizen and doing as close to live fire verbal communication as possible, and have that over and over and over again before they even hit the street, and then even when they're on the street, to keep those communication skills at the forefront. And again, going back to, that's the strongest predictor of citizen satisfaction of the police was a negative contact with the police. And the majority of those negative contacts were things that weren't handled well verbally. And so I think that's where we really ought to be focusing a lot of our attention right now.
Great, thank you, Rich. Interesting, in our earlier discussions, Dave, we had talked a little bit about the PERF report, and you had some pretty interesting comments in regards to information from the PERF report. Would you like to weigh in on that?
Sure. I looked at that thing pretty intently. There's a lot of information in there. There's a lot of very positive points, and I don't want to take away from any of them. I support a lot of what was said. There's also some things that are a little bit, I guess the big question is, where's the evidence? I want evidence-based tactics, training, policy, and procedure. So when you go through the PERF report, some of the big points that stood out to me was, first, the comments about de-escalation and communication training in both academy training and advanced officer training as they continue on. Those two, the issue was that there's not a specific block or enough hours of those two, de-escalation and communication, as comparative to some of these other use of force applications. And, you know, that may be true. But the question is what does another few hours of de-escalation training, where's the evidence that's going to affect change? What is de-escalation training? What does that encompass? What is it defined? Where's the evidence that those portions within that are going to make a difference? I'm all for that, but I hate keywords that are going to solve problems. I think it requires much more of an examination. I think a lot of it has to go back to, I believe it was Rich that was just speaking, and stress inoculation is a huge portion. That's been identified time and time again, but not only this over focus or over training on constant shoot situations, but how about situations much like you talked about, an irate citizen, or any number of the things that we engage in. We can cause stress in those situations that you might experience on the street, and have officers be inoculated against that, so they can manage and keep calm as they progress through these incidents and not lose emotional control, which is so very, very important when they're out on the street. And that kind of progresses into some of the other aspects of that report. The first being this, what appeared to be, based on the comments in the report, is a 30-year misconception or misunderstanding of what has been termed really incorrectly as a 21-foot rule by Dennis Tuller. If you go back to the original article, that is not what his intent was, to have this be a kill zone. And that's how it's discussed in the report, a lot of perceptions or misunderstandings. And if that, in fact, did happen, again, there's where we start looking at evidence-based training. How did that happen? Why did it happen? And how did it persist to the point where it became, at least per the report, some type of national problem? We need to deploy science, human factor science, in policing, but it needs to be used correctly. When we talk about action-reaction time and things of that nature, decision-making, all of that, if you pay attention to human factor science, really goes to the bottom line, that to be able to make good decisions, to analyze, to think, to plan, good judgment, all comes from slowing an event down. And where we see officers making a lot of mistakes in some of these YouTube videos and those type of things that make national news often comes from a rushing in and engaging very rapidly, and the officer gets placed in a position where now they're reacting in a very tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving situation, and sometimes in those situations mistakes are made. So the point being is, our training shouldn't necessarily just fall under a one-word answer. Well, we're going to teach de-escalation for 8 more hours this year, and that's going to make the difference. We need to apply science. We need to look at it. And one of the big things, I think, where we could be successful is both in stress inoculation training and teaching people to slow down, assess the situation a little bit better, and come up with a better judgment, a better decision-making plan. And the last point I'll get on, in the PERF document, they talked about a European national decision-making model. And I think that that's a great model, and it's a very smart choice. We also have a model here that's very similar to that. It's Colonel Boyd's decision-making model, sometimes referred to as the OODA, the Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. It's much more in depth than just what most people think. So I don't necessarily know we need to reach out that far. We have things at home that we can use and deploy in law enforcement to teach officers how to make better decisions. So that's kind of an overview of some of those things that I was thinking about.
Okay. Dave, thank you very much. Hey, Roy, over to you. I'd like to, you had made some earlier comments in our earlier discussion about how technology and the connected officer might be able to help not only for training but for accountability. What ideas do you have about that?
Okay, so Dave makes some very good points. I like the idea, being a social researcher, I love the idea of training being based on some type of science. What we find across the country, of the almost 18,000 agencies across the country, is that the training is, there are some agencies that do training very well. There are some agencies who do training extremely poorly, or the officers are not well equipped to be on the street, because that's, it might have something to do with funding or size of the agency, or it could have to do with the ethos of the particular agency. But one of the things that I think is a real blow to police professionalism today is the fact that there is no standard for police training in the United States. There is no standard for entry into the profession. There's no standard for continuing education into the profession, and there's no standard for holding officers accountable across the board. If we had those same issues in the medical profession in the United States today, there would be nobody going to doctors in the United States, because nobody would tolerate that level of lack of professionalism across the board. So we really, I think the real tough work is, but we can say agencies have to train their officers better, but the fact of the matter is there is no national standard for training. And because of that, a lot of agencies are falling through the cracks on their desire or ability or want to change what their officers are doing. Unfortunately, what I find across talking to most senior leaders in policing, and especially when a major event happens, what they say is, I'm glad it didn't happen here. Because what they're saying is, we're not ready for that. And that speaks directly to our professionalism in this country, and we have to do better work. So more specifically, so back to the technology, there is some emerging technology that can help. There is this mad dash to body cameras, because I think, the citizens are demanding that we do something in regards to body cameras. And unfortunately, the truth is, technology is shining a bright light on bad police behavior. I think some of the things that we see, and some people will argue, well, it's out of context. Well, my argument is we shouldn't be seeing that at all, because some of the things are just deplorable that we see bad police officers doing. So technology is shining a bright light on that. And I think the communities are forcing agencies to go towards body cameras simply because they don't trust the police. They don't trust us, so they want to have more eyes on what we're doing. And there are some technologies out there. There's an emerging technology now that will be able to tell police leadership when an officer unholsters their gun. There's technology out there that's going to say where exactly is a police officer at any particular time. At a last in a show that I was at a few months ago in San Diego, I witnessed a ballistic vest that takes biometric readings from the police officer and sends it back to a central area. So we now know the police officer is now running. He's breathing hard. He's doing this. He's doing that. So I think all of this is all geared towards us getting a clearer view of what police officers are doing every moment of their job, simply because the public trust is so low in our profession. And this technology is going to continue to emerge. I mean, most of us will be at IACP in Chicago in a couple of weeks, and we're going to see amazing technologies, and all these technologies are geared towards reporting police behavior or documenting activity or knowing where a police officer is and what he's actually doing and what he's encountering in, simply because, we have to do the tough work of elevating the public trust.
Right. Well, Roy, thank you. I know I was introduced to you when you did your post. I was LinkedIn or Facebook, where you talked about the 10 rules of police professionalism, and I extra appreciated the fact, as opposed to having 1 to 10, you had 10 items, all of them being number 1. And the second number 1 rule for police professionalism is as follows. I'm going to quote you. Be aware of your biases and keep them in check. All humans have biases. Police officers have biases. No one is calling you unfair or prejudiced because of your biases, but your biases should not, 5 times, dictate how you treat any one particular person, group, or class of citizens. So, Roy, could you please kind of help, what brought you to that, that really heartfelt article that you had done on that?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that question. So I was exposed to a video that was done by a small African-American church outside of Atlanta, and it was about the 10 rules to survive a police contact. And the video was geared towards parents and mothers, really mothers and brothers and aunts and uncles, trying to teach young black men how to survive an encounter with the police. And when I saw that video, I saw, at first it brought tears to my eyes, because as a law enforcement professional and as a father, I would not think that I would have to teach my child how to survive a police encounter today. But regardless of what we say here, the perception out there is that the communities of color have to do something above and beyond to survive a police encounter. And I thought that was very, very unfortunate that we have that. And I am on a personal mission to do everything in my power to change that perception. Because in the end, police must be held accountable for the outcomes of their interactions with citizens. Hold every single profession the same exact way. Someone recently said, well, I can't believe they gave, they recently awarded $6.5 million to the family of the person that was killed in South Carolina by the police. That was a bad thing. No, my explanation was it was punishment for poor policing. That's what it was. That number represents punishment for poor policing, and it's going to get worse. So the 10 rules really came from watching this video and saying, you know, there are things that police officers have to do, and if you do any one of these things, the outcomes can be better, and we have to be held accountable for the outcomes as opposed to now there are situations where we can say, well, the citizen did X, and of course the officer had to respond with Y. Those situations are pretty clear and cut. But when there's bad policing and the community has to be subjected to bad policing, that is the thing we have to get rid of. And oh, by the way, when a section of the community has to teach their children how to survive a police encounter, it goes to show how much work we have to do. We have to do the tough work to transform public policing in America, so that way no segment of the population has to teach their people, that group of people, how to survive a police encounter. And that's where that kind of came from.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciated the heartfelt nature of it too. And it's interesting, we talk about it, and now as we look at the next slide talking about the challenge, we're saying that any significant law enforcement event has the potential to develop into a claim against the agency and the officers involved. So a law enforcement agency should consider not if, but when a lawsuit will come. So, because the idea is you don't think about the training after an event, that's too late. So what are the ideas you guys might have on really helping, you know, agencies prepare for the liability perspective?
Well, Rich, I'll go forward first here. Well, one of the things that's come up several times here is evidence-based, and as I went through, what does the research show influences citizen satisfaction with the police? And more so than anything, you're going to get a complaint filed when the citizen felt that they were treated unfairly. So that the number one predictor there is that negative contact with the police, and so the training, again, I sound like a broken record, I realize that, but training, and I agree with Dave 100%, evidence-based training dealing with citizen contacts with the police, and there are training modules out there that have been empirically tested. In fact, I've tested a couple of them to show that they do have an influence on improving citizen satisfaction between the contact with the officer and the citizen, even when an arrest is made, even when a citation is issued. So I think that's the start, and again, that has to be done a long time in advance. That has to be done in advance even before officers can get on the street. Back in the day, most good police officers learned these communication skills through trial and error. We don't have the time anymore. We don't have the time for them to get up to speed and spend 3 to 5 years learning how to be these communications professionals. They need to know that the moment they hit the street. So I think the training, as the slide says here, the training is the key, and doing that in advance and having it documented. The first thing your attorney is going to ask for, if you're a police chief, when the lawsuit comes, is where's your training records, where's your policies? And if those two things aren't in place, if you don't have a policy that bars an officer from calling someone a derogatory name, where's the standing on that? You know, you've got no leg to stand on with this lawsuit. If you didn't have that in training, that you don't call people bro, you don't call people anything other than sir, ma'am, Mr. So-and-so, Ms. So-and-so, put that in writing. Put that in your policies. Put that in your training, because that's the key. The training and the documentation of the policies and procedures is your first line of defense when it comes to civil litigation.
Dave or Jim, did you have any comments on that?
This is Dave. I just want to kind of mediate how we look at police officers. I agree with Roy. Roy and I have had a lot of conversations in reference to a lot of things going on in law enforcement. I think we also have to be careful to mention there's a tremendous amount of very, very excellent, very, very well-rounded, unbiased, and good working police officers out there that are doing the job right every day. As a matter of fact, it's the great majority. There is bias in policing, just like there's bias in every other field. Anyone who's listening can easily go onto Google and type Harvard implicit bias test, and that's a study that's been online for a very long time, and it'll give you a understanding of where you are in your neutrality when it comes to race. The one thing that I do want to mention is that while that does exist, when you look at the statistics, the factual statistics, there's not, the use of force is very, very low, and I'm kind of going off the top of my head, but the statistics I remember is there's somewhere around 800,000 police officers in the United States making anywhere between 40 and 50 million contacts in any given year, and the use of force statistics that directly relate to the 40, 50 million contacts is below 1% when it comes to an OIS or shooting. So yes, we see things played over and over again in YouTube or in some other places, but it seems to be some of the same instances played over and over again. There's so many more contacts between those 5 or 10 or maybe even 20 a year that get blown up in the news media as being either excessive use of force or any of the number of aspects that come into play. However, there's so many more. It's such a small perspective, and I'm trying to not be so myopic for people who may be listening. Do your research, look at the statistics. Now, on the other hand, when we talk about is there a need for education and training in policing to avoid bias, to understand that it exists, absolutely. I agree with that completely. I also think that bias can be created in other communities. I have a different perspective, come from a different place, and policed a different area than what Roy has, and I understand that his perspective drives some of his comments, and I agree with them completely. I just also think that you can create bias by telling a group of people that here's how you have to act, because that also can lead to a false, that's almost the same type of thing. Police officers are bad, they make bad decisions, and they're going to hurt you, so you have to act in this way to avoid problems. I think the rational, reasonable response in a lot of ways is, hey, you need to comply with the directions of officers in those contexts. It's as simple as that. But to get to the direct question, how to avoid some of this stuff, I think it's going to come through, again, more training on bias. It's going to come from more supervision and leadership when it comes to those things. It's going to come from more contact with elements of society that have maybe have misinterpretations of police and fostering relationships there. You're not going to, we're all human beings, no matter what job or career field we're in. We all have, brains that are going to drive us in one direction or the other, and we all make mistakes. And there can be some fixing in policing, but we also have to be rational with how we look at whether or not this was a simple error or there's some greater underlying content that needs to be considered.
Great, thank you, Dave. I'd just like to remind everyone, if you have any questions, you can submit them to the chat feature on the GoToWebinar down on the lower right. But I'd like to mention one thing. We had mentioned in an earlier discussion the concept of gold standards for training, and a few states were mentioned. Could you all talk a little bit about what you believe makes up a gold standard for a training program or for processes for training?
Yeah, I'll step into that one. So one of the things I think is very important in any type of training is we have to ask the question, you know, what do we want officers to do that they're not doing now? And then we have to be able to measure the behavior change. And I'll tell you, probably across the country, the rule more than the exception is we train police officers to do their policing job in whatever community they're in, and then we set them out there, but there's no really mechanism for checking on that training or making sure there's some impact on that training. The Chicago Police Department does training on police legitimacy and procedural justice. They are 5 years into that program, and they're showing significant reductions in their use of force and citizen complaints that they can directly tie to that training. So to Dave Blake's point and to Rich's point, we as a profession have to get better at having science-based training and then doing some type of analysis that follows up on that training to say, hey, are we getting it right? And if we're not getting it right, what do we have to change, tweak, adjust to the training to make to address the issues that are happening out there in the field? But I'm going to say this again, and I said this before, many of the agencies in the country are small agencies who don't have the expertise in the development of training or have the resources to provide training. And this is a significant issue, a significant hurdle that has to be overcome. So yeah, and to Dave's point, there are millions and millions of officers getting it right every single day, and it's a few that are getting it wrong that are hurting us. And because we don't control the narrative, right? Who is supposed to inform the public about what the police do? The police. But the police have been silent for 30 years. And there are still senior leaders out there who believe that no comment is an appropriate response to an issue. And I most certainly have a challenge with that. So yeah, there are some gold standards out there, but I think the more fundamental issue is, even if I was to issue a gold standard to a police department in East Texas where that has 4 or 5 officers, how are they going to implement that gold standard without the resources? And I'm talking money here, about the money and the appropriate individuals, guys like Dave Blake who travel around the country delivering benchmark training. How do we make that available to them? And I know that I'm going a little long, but you know, you put up a slide that talked about PD and how much money they pay in lawsuits. I got an idea. This is how we pay for training. We reduce the amount of incidents so we can have training. We're on pace to spend almost $1 billion this year settling civil lawsuits against law enforcement when we can use that money towards training. But you know, that's my opinion. So.
Right. I've heard the phrase that the cost of, you know, training is expensive, but when compared to defending lawsuits, it's even more. We had a question that I just wanted to address that was, we were referencing, Rich, your study in July. That was the study of the law enforcement studies. And I just wanted to mention that it's entitled, What Influences Overall Citizen Satisfaction with the Police? And Rich, could you let our listeners know where that can actually be downloaded?
Yeah, that was a piece I wrote for the Public Agency Training Council, the PATC. They're at patc.com. And when you go there, they've got a weekly legal update, and now I've started working with them for a research newsletter once a month as well. So when you go to their website, look up the archive for the legal updates, and that's where you can find all the research articles I've written for them. That isn't a true empirical peer-reviewed research article. That's just a literature review written for the police executive to give them an overview of what the actual scientific empirical research is saying.
Right. Thank you, Rich. Well, what we'll do too, we do kind of a post-mortem write-up of the webinar, and we'll include links to any of the references in that, so you'll be able to see that on the follow-up to the webinar page here as well. I'd like to pose one other question that was brought up was, and it's in particular to police leadership. How can police leadership affect or address that negative trend, and how do you kind of lead by example? Would anyone like to speak towards that?
Yeah, so I'll speak towards it because I think it's very important. Because you look at a lot of these incidents that show up on YouTube or on the internet, and I always ask myself, where is the first line supervisor? You know, we have to train police supervisors, especially the first line supervisors. I'm talking about the sergeants out there, field training officers, how to be present and purposeful in their job. Most police officers believe, and we have trained them for many generations, that police officers are automatons. They go out there, they do a job, and for a large portion of their time, I'd say 95% of a police officer's time in the field is unsupervised. We have to increase the presence of police supervision in public policing, so that way when there is an encounter that is going south with a citizen, or if a citizen asks, I want to talk to a supervisor, that supervisor should be available. Unfortunately, what we find for a lot of incidences, especially for small agencies across the country, there are police officers who are on duty, and there is not a supervisor that's on duty along with them. Another thing that I think there's a challenge, in public policing, most police officers don't get any type of leadership training until they become a lieutenant or above. I'm amazed at how much leadership training there is available for chief level officers across the country that is not available for a police officer on the street. Every single officer is a leader. We must train them in the fundamentals of followership. We must train them in the fundamentals of small unit leadership until they get to the point where they are supervisors. By the time they get to be a supervisor, a person should understand and know what it takes to be a police leader. And I think there is a big loss in that. You know, we don't allow doctors to become doctors without the appropriate training in this country and validation. But we allow police supervisors to be leaders in our organizations, and they have not received the appropriate training to be a police leader. So what do they fall back on? They fall back on their police mentality because that's all they know. The agency hasn't sent them to any training. They haven't received any training. And that's probably the crust of the book, my last book that I wrote, which is called The Leader's Compass for Law Enforcement Professionals. And it's all about a sergeant who was promoted in the morning. He was on duty that night, and he has 8 or 10 officers in his squad, all with different leadership needs, and nobody has to protect and serve a community, and he has absolutely no idea how to do it. So the book is really about how this sergeant, this newly promoted sergeant, finds his leadership way. And oh, by the way, he makes some huge mistakes along the way. And what we're seeing in public policing is a leadership issue, but we're not training people to lead across the board. Now, I will say this: there are some people who are doing it right. I get it, but for the vast majority of the 18,000 public police departments across the country, the rule is no training until promotion, and the chance of you actually receiving any type of leadership training doesn't happen until you become a lieutenant or beyond.
That's great. Thank you. It's interesting. We had a follow-up question that I wanted to pose that really kind of talked about it. We're now in this kind of new media where it's instant news out there, and now all of a sudden there is an event that an agency now needs to deal with. And the question is this, are there any model policies for how to interact with the public post an incident? So how can you do it better knowing what we know from Ferguson and these other events?
Well, I'll just throw in real quick here. Just the panelists, one of the panelists you had last time, Harry Dolan, he and I have done some team teaching, and as far as a model policy, I can't speak to that, but he's brought up when he was the police chief in Raleigh, North Carolina, and police chief in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and in both situations when they had officer-involved shootings, it was generally the external investigation that came in either from the state or at least from the local prosecutor's office. And just being able to balance the things where they're coming in to do the investigation, and he's making all of his information available, all of his officers available for interview. You got copies of all the reports, all the 911 tapes, everything you need. And then, well, Chief, we appreciate if you don't say anything while we're working on our investigation. It might compromise our investigation. And that's where he draws the line and says, that's fine for you, but I work here, and I live here, and these are my people in this community. I've got to let them know what's going on. So he's real focused on, at least within 24 hours, at least find out what we know and sharing that with the community and being upfront from the very beginning. But another thing he really harps upon here, which piggybacks off a lot of what Roy's been saying, is before he gets it to the media, he contacts his contacts in the community. Frequently it's clergy members or business leaders, to let them know what's going on before he releases that information. Those relationships have to be in place long before the shooting incident occurs. Otherwise, well, why are you calling me to tell me all of a sudden when you didn't want to hear any of our community concerns before this? So it's important to develop those relationships beforehand to be able to get those that communication out. And then I'll shut up and let anybody talk about if they've got a model policy that they can use.
Yeah, Dave, I'd like to open that up for you if that's possible.
Well, I don't have a model policy. I was just going to comment and say that I think it's very in line with what Richard said. I think we have to get out in front of these things as much as possible. The problem is even something within 24 hours, when you really think about it, some of this stuff goes out almost immediate, and the comments start rolling in, and the commentary starts. Could be almost synonymous with the event actually occurring, with how fast things go viral, how fast information gets out on social media. So even responding within several hours after an event, you could have already lost the information war if it goes viral in a negative light. So, and I agree, we have to really start looking at this, to try to figure out a way to mitigate or try to get our message out in regards to whatever the situation was. There was an event several years ago at SFPD Police Chief Gascon. There was a shooting of a man in a wheelchair that occurred, and he had a press conference with the media approximately 4 hours later, where he talked about some of the potential aspects that came into play with this shooting, which, by the way, was caught on scene by somebody's cell phone video and started going out there very quickly. So he jumped on that event very quickly and addressed as much as he could. And of course, as was mentioned, there's other issues about the sensitive nature of an investigation and the case and how much information we're going to let out there. But as I've said in a lot of other forums, it's a risk versus gain analysis. Is it more risky to give out some of those details to potentially calm the public or give them the information that they want, comparative to what may be lost later on in case investigations or probably in a civil situation? So that's kind of my thought on it.
Yeah. So I'll jump in here. So I recently attended, the FBI does some training on post-major incident response. And if you look at how Chief David Brown for the Dallas Police Department responded to the recent issue that we had where the police department was shot up, the headquarters building was shot up by an individual who was less than happy with police services that he received in the past. Or if you look at how Chief Will Johnson of the Arlington Police Department responded to the young man who broke into the car dealership and was jumping up and down on cars, and we later found out he was on some very powerful mind-altering drugs. So there is a process, and I can make the document available if you like. They teach a very simple methodology, and the methodology has to do with, we need to recognize that you have about, after a major police incident, you have about 20 minutes to seize the narrative. You have about 20 minutes to seize the narrative. So if something happens, whether it's a shooting or a major incident, there needs to be some type of commentary coming from the police, and no comment is not acceptable. We have to say something, because then what happens is social media is looking for the police, the actual legitimate authority on the incident, to have some type of comment. What happens after about 20 minutes is you have those negative individuals out there who are spewing this narrative poison that ultimately takes away from the message. So you get up in front of the public and you acknowledge an event has happened. The second thing is you talk about if it's an incident and it results in the loss of life, we have to express some type of empathy towards what has happened. And then we have to talk about our policy. What is going to happen next? Because most people don't understand what the police policies are and what the procedures is. And oh, by the way, inside of giving the policies and procedures, talk about a little bit about a timeline that says something to the effect of, I will be, taking your questions and updating you on information on the hour or every 2 hours or as things happen. And then, oh, by the way, do some type of recap on what you have said and what you're clear about, what you can and cannot do. So that's kind of generally, I'm trying to take it all from memory, but I can most certainly make the flow chart that they made available to us during the training available to the people on the webinar if they would like it. But, for a lot of police agencies and a lot of senior leaders just don't understand this right now is, time is not on your side at a major incident. And if you're not predisposed or don't have a personality for dealing with the media, you better go find somebody right now, because people are going to be looking for the police organization to say something, and we always get ourselves in trouble. I don't care if you're NYPD or Orange Police Department in Southeast Texas. The community expecting you to say something, and if your usual process is to say nothing and no comment, you need to probably really think about how much longer you're going to be in public policing, because the community has been pretty clear on that. They want to hear from the police, and we have to start talking about it.
That's well said. Thanks for that, Roy. This is Chris from Paladin Data Systems again. We do have a couple more questions. I realize that we are up against our hour. We started a little bit late, but we will, again, we'll make this available to as an on-demand recording for anyone that has to drop off. If the panel is still available, we do have a couple more questions, and we'll continue fielding those. One was training is contingent on budget. Small towns are cutting budgets, making it almost impossible to get quality training. How do we get training that is not so expensive for a small agency?
Okay, so Dave. Go ahead, Dave. Go ahead, Dave. Go ahead. You're the guy out there. Go ahead.
I just got a couple ideas on this very briefly. One is you got to think outside the box when it comes to training. Not everything involves some massive, drawn-out, multi-day scenario-based training effort or any of these type of things, or bringing in outside folks. There are very tabletop-related exercises. Dr. Gary Klein, the master of decision-making, has looked into some of this stuff and mentioned some very small, you provide a narrative, semi-ambiguous decision-making scenario on paper, and you present that to a group of officers, and you ask them, you have 2 minutes to give me a quick response. And you'll have senior officers and junior officers at the table, and obviously you're going to start getting different responses, and ultimately you're building a decision-making model just by running through this, and that person facilitating it can start pushing it in different directions. Well, what if this happens? What if this happens? And you can create a lot of good decision-making for decision-making training. Some of the other things that we can do is how difficult is it, many police departments spend 30, 40, maybe even an hour in a briefing kind of talking about various things prior to going out to shift. What about taking a portion of that time and coming up just finding one specific skill that you would like to work on, whether it's a DT thing, a firearm skill, or something that has to do with policy and procedure, and focusing on that and either creating a vignette that deals with that or some type of practical skill application opportunity that you only take 10 to 20 minutes to do. And lastly, there's a concept, probably somebody could search for this, is a hood drill in which you blind the officer, put a hood over their head or sunglasses in some type of situation, and that hood comes off, and they're very quickly presented with either a threat or a non-threat situation. It's kind of the stress inoculation Rich was talking about earlier. And you can do that very rapidly and allow an officer to experience up to 5 scenarios in really, if it's set up well, in about 5 minutes. And then you can go back on to whatever they need to do. So there's there's a tremendous amount of ways to get very good training in a very short amount of time. We just have to think outside the box.
Yeah.
That's very good.
Yeah, and I have to agree.
Yeah. Go ahead, Roy.
Yeah, I have to agree with Dave. You know, public policing is at a point now where we can't use lack of training as an excuse anymore. We have to start thinking outside the box. We have to get better at grant writing. And this is one of the things I've told, especially small agencies. I've had this robust conversation before. In most communities where there are small agencies, they need to group together and conduct training. They need to get with their city managers and say, hey, we're spending X amount of money on our insurance policy to cover police behavior. What if we work with the insurance companies? Because research says that we can reduce our liability by 60% if we get officers trained, as opposed to setting aside millions of dollars a year to pay for future issues. Okay, so most people don't know that most municipalities are either self-insured or have some type of insurance policy, but the municipalities themselves set aside something like $1 or $2 or $3 or up to $6 million a year to settle complaints against the police. What if we took some of that money, set aside money, and put that money towards training? Because we know if they're appropriately trained, it's going to reduce our liability by about 60%. So we need to start having robust conversations about how we finance policing and looking outside the box and taking every opportunity to train officers. Just like Dave Blake said, you know, every opportunity is a training opportunity, and we need to get much better at that.
That's perfect. Thank you. Hey, I know we kind of want to wrap up for the hour, but I know we're a little over that. But I'd love to end with this kind of question. What are each of your kind of go-to resources that you could recommend for that? And if you want to share and follow up, we'll include that in the write-up portion of the webinar. But if there's any kind of go-to resources that you would recommend, Dave, can we start with you?
Sure, I have a couple. The first is not only my own website, of course, but www.cti/home.com underneath the articles document section. Not only is there a media kit that you can look at and possibly formulate some ideas on how to present things in a press conference or other situation with use of force. I also look toward a lot of science. James McElvain, who's now a police chief up in Washington State, and also a PhD, wrote his doctoral thesis on police shootings and citizens' behavior. That'll give you a lot of insight to what's going on in a police officer's mind and some of the dynamics that are involved in some of these situations. I also recommend The Invisible Gorilla by Chris Chabris and Daniel Simons. Talks about intuition, talks about how our brain works and how we make decisions. And lastly, John Medina wrote a pretty simple to understand, really nice and exciting read, I think, called Brain Rules. And I'm pushing the science because a lot of people, that is the national, I think, frame of reference that might be missing when people look at some of the things that officers are involved in and some of the reasons they may or may not make mistakes or error. If we can look at, understand how we work a little bit better, that also has a lot to do with how we should be applying, how the citizenry can look at police in some of these situations, and also internally as police organizations. If we understand the science a little bit, we may make change applying it to policy, procedures, tactics, and trainings to do things like create stress inoculation, teach officers to slow down, and to understand how fast and rapidly something can unfold so that they don't have a false sense of security or overconfidence. So there's just a few from me.
Thank you. Roy, how about you? Are there any go-to resources you recommend?
Well, my number one go-to resource is the Department of Justice's website. All the research that the Department of Justice does, all of their reference material, everything is right there, and you can almost find almost anything that was ever published, researched on, documented on. All the resources, all the references are there. You know, we have to become better. Police officers have to become better police scientists. We have to become students of the business of policing. We have to read more. You know, I'm kind of shocked at how few people have read the President's 21st Century document on policing, and how many reports that the Department of Justice puts out or PERF puts out. We have to become better at that. So we have to visit those web sources on the websites on a regular basis. Another thing, you know, each agency is a resource. You know, I'm on a regular basis, I reach out to the training people at NYPD or Chicago PD or LAPD or other agencies that are doing it right, and I reach out to them, call them on the phone, and they are always willing to send me documents, send me training modules, give me information, tell me how they do a certain thing. One of the things that I always do is when there's a major police incident that grabs a lot of attention, after it kind of settles down, I call the agency and say, hey, let's talk about this, and can you give me some insight, and how can I learn? Police departments want to talk to other police departments, and we just have to just respect the resource, but you can get a lot of stuff out of that. So
that is great. That's great.
Great. Well, thanks again to our panelists, Roy, Dave, and Rich. We really appreciate your time. Hopefully the audience found the information that you were able to share useful. Again, we will send out the information for each of our panelists, some of the resources that they mentioned in our summary email to the audience. And we'll also provide an on-demand recording of the webinar. Again, thanks guys for your time, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.